I believe this is one of the most beautifully worded questions that I've ever received, and you're going to see why on the screen right now. Hello, Jordan. I could not find a video explicitly about grief amongst your uploads. Grief not just about loss of life, but connection, illusion, innocence, what never was, the unlived and the forever gone. This absence struck me as it seems fundamental to integration and cannot be bypassed. Could you speak to its purpose, its capacity to evade our defenses, its alchemical, heart-opening power, the repercussions of unfelt or disavowed grief, and your experience and understanding of it? And then they continue, it is quite profound what grief asks of us, how it moves us and reorganizes us. It is like a light projecting backwards, reauthoring time and illuminating things that were once hidden, moments and deeds and conversations seemingly forgotten, maybe mundane, maybe too activating at the time. They re-emerge from the depths and we relive them through the prism of grief. I'm not kidding when that is one of the most beautifully complete questions that I've received, because I almost feel like I don't need to answer the question itself. Today's question asked me to speak about the power of sacred grief and grief work being a healing opening to another world of identity and possibility, and I almost filmed the video for me. If you enjoyed the language that was shared there, you will enjoy a book like this one, The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Willer. This book is sacred and poetic, and literally from the back you can see, in this lyrical handbook for mastering the art of grieving, Francis Willer is the go-to recommendation for someone who enjoyed that idea that grief is something which is sacred and worth going into. I really, really recommend you read this book, because it is exactly the theme of today's video. There are a few more books that I'll recommend up front if you're in the grief work process and you already have accepted that you need to do some grief work for something that's happened in the past or something that's recently happened. I recommend from a developmental trauma perspective you read Legacy of the Heart by Wayne Muller. As you can see from the subheading there, The Spiritual Advantages of a Painful Childhood. This is a book that will allow you to grieve and work through the disappointment, the tragedy, the abuse and the alienation of your earliest years. And if you're someone who's likewise got early developmental trauma that you need to work through, but you also have more adult-specific trauma related to career, relationship, family, or maybe spiritual problems of one form or another, my go-to book is Swamplands of the Soul by James Hollis. Many of my shadow work library students in my private community have, I wouldn't say enjoyed this book, but they have benefited massively from reading a book which deals with it doesn't deal with it deals with grief and shame and apathy and all kinds of feelings that you can see right there on the front. And as the energy goes up to a crescendo of recommending books, I also recommend finally that you read this book, which sadly I cannot say on YouTube because YouTube does not like that top word, but this is by James Hillman. It's a fantastic book from Jungian psychology perspective on what's happening when you're going through a bit of a dark night of the soul and how to get out of it and the greater possibilities, and going back to Francis Willer, the re-enchantments that can come from the grief work process. Today's questioner is basically today's video maker. They say, very, very accurately, can I speak to the capacity for grief to evade our defenses, its alchemical heart-opening power, and the repercussions of unfelt or disavowed grief and your experience and understanding of it? I could, and yet I haven't. They also pointed out from the beginning of their comment that they haven't found a video on my channel about grief specifically, and they are correct. I have never, in 300 videos on YouTube, made a grief psychology video, and it's time for me to be basically controversially honest about why I haven't made that video in particular. First things first, I do not have the particular romanticization of grief as a motivation strategy for me to go into painful experiences. Personally speaking, I went into a you-know-what kind of ideational state, again, that first word from that book, no longer wanting to be here, from about the age of 10. And I didn't get out of it until I was in my early 20s. It was about 11 or 12 years of being in that state where I didn't want to be here. I didn't need a re-enchantment of the pain that I was in and apathy and the lack and significant lack of desire to be here. I wanted an out. I didn't need a re-enchantment of grief. I wanted an escape from the agony that I was in. I was in an atmosphere of suffocation, an apathetic well of pain. I didn't need a re-enchantment. It wasn't a personal motivating strategy. But as I've reflected on this question for the last week, filming many different videos and really keeping this one in the back of my mind because I haven't filmed a video on this in over 300 videos, I had to come to a confession moment with myself and realize that grief work is basically three processes, three stages in a single process to be more accurate. There's the acceptance that I've been wounded, which is, oh, I'm bleeding. You need to accept that you're bleeding. There's then the bandaging stage where you start repairing, and part of the repairing is maybe a bit more bleeding, a bit more of treating the wound, and actually the acceptance goes into an active process. And then the third stage is moving on. When the scar has finally formed, it is enough to say, the scar is there, I will never forget, and eventually you put down the wound that became a bandage, that became scar tissue. The problem with filming grief psychology videos for a YouTube audience in particular is that I hesitate to excessively romanticize a painful process which is not necessarily an outcome in of itself. I am heavily biased as someone who does practical, holistic life coaching and mentoring to not only going into the darkness and the trauma and the despair. I'm very comfortable with doing that. I've heard horrific, unbelievable stories of horrors that people have endured as children, as babies, and even abuses that they have noticed in their later life. I have heard the stories. I have been with people in tears and rage and sorrow. However, I always see the grief work that we're doing as a meaningful and sanctified process to move into a greater level of understanding in service of something else. If this is point A, and a self-actualizing life with beneficial, joyful outcomes is point B, grief is part of that journey between, and it's my job when I'm working with someone for 4 months not only to be with them in their pain and their sorrow, and to open up the space for that if they haven't already opened it up already, but actually to add in the light as well. It is not merely enough to sit with the darkness from my perspective. I want the darkness to be emptied out. That's the first stage. Into the second stage of grief, the acceptance, into the bandaging. I also then want to know how to guide people out of the grieving stage and into the self-actualization and moving on stage. But this depends on the individual and depends what you're grieving from. If you clicked on a video about sacred grief, you probably feel pretty inspired by the books I mentioned at the very start of the video, especially The Wild Edge of Sorrow. For me, as a YouTube trauma-informed life coaching figure, I can't make too many videos on grief psychology that actually fit in my repertoire of topics that I will then be typically working with my students and my clients, which is why I haven't made the video. What happens, full disclosure, when you start making videos that go towards things like the dark night of the soul, or grief psychology, or sacred grief, or any particular traumas that are nameable, is that you will attract an audience based on the algorithm who are really dealing with that wound. And that's beautiful and incredible. It allows the right information to go to the right people. The problem with grieving people in particular isn't that they are a problem. It's just that in terms of the capacity that they have to be able to receive other aspects of the inner work and the holistic psychology, you are often consumed by the grief and there really isn't much space for anything else. And this is where I have to look out for myself and my channel as someone who makes videos on the internet. You might say that's cowardly, and you are right. But also practically, what I've noticed when I've done videos that are adjacent to grief psychology in the past is that you'll get comment sections of people who are very rightfully sharing their stories of trauma and horror. But then when I put up the video the next week and the week after about self-actualization, aspiration, higher levels of consciousness, or maybe more theoretical videos about certain things that are happening at the higher planes of spiritual well-being, they can't get into it because they're consumed by the grief. You reach a paradoxical roadblock of me encouraging someone to go into the grief because there is sacred lessons to be learned through the pain. And yet, if they are properly going through those lessons, they are blinded in on their personal trauma and they have not got the capacity to be looking at other aspects of inner work. So I don't make the videos. I do not make the videos, but I do definitely work with my clients and my students on these topics. Only the other week, we had a Shadow Work Library seminar where one of the members is going through particularly horrific personal circumstances. And in the middle of that 20-person group seminar, I was basically one-to-oneing them in terms of going deeper into the pain and addressing the feelings that have yet to be felt. And other members joined in. We created this community moment where there were about 5 or 6 of us circling around a particular member. And there were certain moments where emotions started rising, and I'll protect their confidentiality, but it was a powerful moment for anyone that was there. Any Shadow Work Library students watching this video, you know what this moment was. I'm willing to do the grief work. I see the importance of grieving and feeling the feelings that are meant to be felt. But my problem as a coach and a therapeutic figure who's interested in beneficial life outcomes at the other side of grief is that I cannot risk pedestalizing grief too much, because what tends to happen, again, not just from a YouTube algorithm perspective of bringing in people who are very much in that state of consciousness and can't relate to the rest of the work that I'm trying to give them, which then harms the channel and harms the ability for me, my videos to then be able to reach more people and blah, 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 blah. The real problem is, to make videos that do well and get attention for heavy topics like the dark night of the soul and grief psychology can create a sense of false reward and excessive enchantment of something which should only ever be temporary. One of the major risks, and this is controversial, but I've seen it a few times over, one of the major risks in getting too into grief work is you become addicted to your pain. You become addicted to the romanticization of feeling your pain more specifically. It is difficult to precisely pinpoint where exactly the addiction begins and where it is merely a healthy immersion in the grief. But when you're creating YouTube videos, you are creating an echo chamber and an amplification chamber in the comments section where people will give likes and comments to other people sharing their brave stories and bold stories of getting their grief out into the open. I am somewhat sarcastic in that statement because I need to show you the other side. It is genuinely bold and genuinely brave to share a story of grief, but certain people in comment sections, they are 20 years deep on a certain grief wound, and they are stuck in a cycle of being congratulated for being vulnerable and open and authentic about their pain. This is one of the major traps within sacred grief work, or at least the community and common idea of what sacred grief work is, because it's a loose collective of videos on the internet or comment sections on various social medias, or maybe pop-up workshops here and there, rather than the focused community. For example, my Shadow Work Library community, where we're meeting every single week. That is very different from the liminoid space where it's somewhat shady, unclear borders of sanctity. It creates very, very, very different outcomes. You are at risk of perpetually cycling on your pain. If you're watching videos like this one, go into the comment section, somewhat feeding off of other people's grieving stories beyond a certain point. If you have yet to admit that you have been wounded, it is great to be watching videos like this, but how many weeks or months or years do you need to be watching them? Someone will have clicked on this video for the first time today at the idea of sacred grief. The idea of grief work is a new idea. Someone else, they're 10 years deep into the concept. I say to the person who's new, welcome, go into the books. You've got pain to feel, get it out of you. Go through it, learn something. I say to the person who's 10 years deep, in the most loving sense possible, when have you cried enough? When have you looked enough? When have you gone far enough into the pain that you don't need to keep spending time in the painful place? When is the murder scene a murder scene? And it should be walked away from rather than the place that you're actively investigating and you've got out the detective eyeglass. Just look for the very personal, very unique timeline that you're on and apply your grief work appropriately. There are a few final points I want to make before ending the video. Again, this is truly not meant to be a discouragement for why you should or should not do grief work. It's awkward for me to say this. I'm just trying to be honest about why I haven't made a single video on grief psychology in 300 videos on YouTube, even though it's a very common theme in my client work and my student work, because it doesn't translate to online communities very well. It doesn't translate to the parasocial relationship we've got right now, where I'm talking at you, and if you want to talk back at me, there's then a comment section where other people see it, and it just does not translate. It creates amplification chambers of pain, and it creates a pseudo-enchantment, a romanticization of the tragedy, which can be perpetuated much longer than necessary. You will also see this same theme in people who are recovering, unfortunately, from things like narcissistic abuse or cheating partners. You can join into these echo chambers of different communities who are in pain, and you feed off a very heavy, very bleedy thought form that the whole group has, and you get a sense of being uplifted and met, but it doesn't actually allow for the healing to go deeper. What you really would do well to do is read the books privately on your own without the necessary mirroring. Fun fact, this is also something that I've noticed. I'm going to be honest, because the Shadow Work Library has been running for nearly a year. And initially when I launched the Shadow Work Library, it was just a self-paced solo curriculum. And I said to my mentor several years ago, I do not want to add an active community because I know what will happen if people are processing trauma and they have a community. One very beneficial thing will happen, and also a quite detrimental thing is very likely to happen. The very beneficial thing is they'll get to talk to me, and I'll get to talk to other students and do community processing in a group coaching environment. I'll get to have circle conversations. Quite literally, I host it on Circle, so they have circle conversations. They have conversations in the round, and we work together and we help each other. It's the equivalent of energetically giving each other hugs, holding hands, and working on problems together. That's fantastic. That's a big benefit. The second issue, though, the issue that will arise, I called this ahead of time, and now I can say with confidence this is what's happened. There's certain wounds and certain traumatic experiences, not all of them, which are not meant to be felt or shared or spoken about all that much with others. It's you and your soul. I hope I'm not misunderstood there. There is great power in community. I have been working in community all this year, and for years I've been helping people in deeply intimate relationships in a coaching professional capacity. But there are certain wounds that you might encounter when you're reading a book, for example, like Swamplands of the Soul. For you to then read a bit of this book, put a post, put a comment, send a message to someone, the energy of grief and the energy of pain's built up inside of you, you cathartically release it before it's completed. If coal turns to diamond through pressure, the ability to let off the pressure when the coal has merely just condensed a little bit, but you're feeling like it's too much, rather than letting it go for more weeks and more months, it often takes out the big benefit of getting to the other side of the pain. You'll get the likes, you'll get the comments, you'll get the gratifications, you'll get the strokes and the hugs and the keep going, you can do it kind of energy. And because you'll then be having grief energy, and then you'll be met with like, you can do it, let's go energy, you get shifted into, I got reward, I got validated, and this gets forgotten. I'm trying to speak at a higher level than regular here. I hope I'm not being misunderstood to disencourage grief work and trauma work. I'm just trying to encourage you, from this video on grief work, and from my experiences working in a community where we talk about very heavy topics, that there is a very particular trap of depressurizing yourself too soon. There's another particular trap of romanticizing a tragedy for too long. The sweet spot is doing neither, and the way to properly do your grief work is to get the tears out of you, to get the rage out of you, to journal and reflect, and learn the lessons of pain and accept that it will never be the way it was, or never be the way that you wished it could be. Your love does not have a place to go anymore. And that's tragic. But don't build a new identity around the person who is grieving. Do not become a grieving person, because what will happen, I guarantee this will happen, is when it's time to move on from the grief, you will not know where to land your new feet. You will rebirth within the container of grief, but the person that you have become needs to go somewhere else, and the grieving identity is a skin to shed. It is a layer to fall behind. Many people do not want to make the transition because it's yet to be enchanted, this new world. They have entered into the cauldron, they have burnt themselves down, they've immolated their pain, and they've come out like a phoenix from the ashes. But where do you fly next? Take all of that enchantment and romanticization towards the pain and put it towards a new direction of life. A new role in the world, a new relationship, a new career, a new perspective which maybe doesn't get into a new relationship. Say, for example, you lost a significant loved one. There's no possible replacement. How could there be a replacement? But you take the lesson of the pain, and you still move the thrust of your life in a more expansive, life affirmative direction. Otherwise you do run the risk. As I've stumbled all over in this video, you run the risk, my intermediate friend, of becoming an artificially prolonged grieving person when actually there's a lot more light that's right there for you. Tried to do many things in this video. Read the books if they called to you. If you're in the middle of grief, good luck, keep going deeper. If you're towards the end of your grief, consider ending it. Make a ritual, a closing ritual. If it's a kind of grief that you'll never forget, that's perfect. Make a token, make it sanctified. But just watch out for how much energy every single day, every single week, and every single month is going towards the wound. If you know in your heart and you know in your soul that there's more to life. And there's more beauty. You're not disvalidating the memory of the thing that you're grieving by having more beauty and more hope in the next month ahead. Just try and find the space between. I'll see you in the comments section.